title in my notes is, this context is, don't let your liberty become your Lord. If you've been through the training program, you'll remember that. Don't let your liberty become your Lord. How might we let our liberty, something that is not wrong, something that we don't have to do or not do, we can choose to do it or not do it, how could that become our Lord? Any ideas? I know that's my title, so you may not know, but does that sound familiar, Jason?
The weights that inhibit you on your spiritual journey, your run, those weights might not initially begin as something that is a problem, or even something that are wrong, but they may keep you from reaching your full potential and even turn into something that is the problem.
Absolutely. We probably all have some things that we would be tempted to say, I'm not giving this up. I don't have to. And I don't care what they say. I don't care what they do. I'm not doing that. I have a right. You know, we hear a lot about that today. I have rights, and we do. And we have rights scripturally. We have liberties. And what Paul is saying is, make sure you don't let that become this, I'm not giving this up, I'm going to die on this hill. When you do that, that liberty is no longer a liberty. It's your Lord. You're serving it instead of it serving you. We've got to be real careful with things like that. And so that's why in chapter 8, Paul is warning them about the fact that they can let this issue of meat sacrificed to idols actually become something that they're just not willing to give up. And in chapter 9, Paul's going to talk about some things that are really hard to give up that he had to be willing to give up in order to save other people. I'm going to tell you, I'm really glad that so far I haven't had to give up eating meat for anyone's conscience. I'm glad I don't live in that culture because that would be a tough one for me. Giving up some other food, that'd probably be fine, but not eating meat. This is one of those things that Paul is talking about. And so as he starts out there in chapter 8, he's making sure that they understand that eating meat offered to idols is not wrong because an idol is nothing. But, and I'm not going to teach chapter 8. I know someone's already done that well. But look in verse 10. He brings up the real issue. In verse 10 he said, for if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating where? In the idol's temple. Will not the conscience of him who is weak be emboldened to eat those things offered to idols? He introduces the problem. Eating that meat's not a problem. The idol is nothing, but there could be a problem with this liberty. Now, he introduces that. He tells them that, yes, we know there's nothing wrong with it, but if that's all we're focused on is knowing right and wrong and not caring about how it might impact my brother, we're going to do a disservice to the church. We do need to know what's right. We do need to know what's wrong. And if this isn't wrong, I have a liberty. But there's another element that comes in, and that's what he's talking about. Love edifies. So when I have the proper love for my brother, I'm going to say, I don't have to do this or not do this. And if that's going to impact this person in a negative way, I've got to give that a serious consideration. And if it's going to cause that person to sin, which is a key statement, not hurt their feelings or not, people say, well, that offends me when you do that. Bless your heart. That's not what the word offend in the Bible means, to cause to sin. It doesn't mean you got your feelings hurt. The Bible's not saying that I got to make sure I don't hurt anyone's feelings. It's saying that I've got to make sure that I'm not doing something that's going to lead you into sinning against your conscience. That's what was happening when they ate in the idol's temple. So in chapter 9, what Paul is doing is he's giving them examples of things that he was willing, liberties that he was willing to set aside for the good of others. What were the things that he brought up here, quickly? Being married. What's the second one? Being paid as a preacher. Both of those were liberties. He had a right to receive support from them, but he said, there's a reason why I didn't do that, because the Judaizing teachers would have jumped on that and accused me of doing this for money, and I wasn't going to give them that. I cared more about your souls, and so Paul received support from other churches. Paul wasn't saying he didn't receive support. We know from other passages he received support from other churches. But then he goes on down and he talks about, beginning in verse 19, he said, I'm free from all men, but I've made myself a servant of others. And he talks about to the Jews, I became as a Jew, in the sense of where they were restricting themselves. If he was going to do something that might cause them to sin against their conscience, he would be restricted there. To those who are not under the law, the Gentiles, which is this context is dealing with, he was willing to acquiesce to those things, such as eating meat sacrificed to idols. And he said in verse 22, to the weak I became as weak. That doesn't mean weak and worldly. He's talking about those who are weak in their faith, like Romans 14 talks about. They're still more restrictive on themselves than they have to be. That's not weak in the sense that they don't have strength. They have a lot of strength. They've got a lot of self-discipline. It's weak in the sense of maturity where their conscience catches up with their intellect. They know that's not wrong, but their conscience makes them feel guilty if they do it. And in that sense, they're weak, not as we think of weak, but they haven't matured to the point to where their conscience catches up with their intellect. And so Paul said, in those situations, I became as they were, so I don't cause them to stumble. Now in verse 24, he's saying, you know, even athletes understand that there are areas of liberties that they have to give up if they want to compete. An Olympian doesn't eat at McDonald's if they're training. Most of them don't. I don't know. There may be some people that, maybe if you're in a bobsled, you don't have to worry about that. But a track runner in the Olympics does not go and eat at McDonald's. It's not wrong. It's not against the rules. But he foregoes or she foregoes certain liberties in order to compete. And Paul said, we understand that concept, but you know, we're running for an eternal crown. And in that same way, we may have to practice some self-control and buffet or discipline our body in areas of liberty. And Paul said, here's what I've realized. Notice he says in verse 27, I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I preach to others, I myself should become disqualified. How could Paul become disqualified if it's in a realm of liberties? Offending his brother. A lack of concern for the fact that this has caused his brother to sin. So we have to understand that whole thing as we get to chapter 10, because all of a sudden he's going to start talking about Moses and being baptized into Moses and the cloud and the sea. What does that have to do with liberties? And it feels like, and for years I'd read this and think, wait a minute, what just happened? It's almost like you switched the channel immediately on me. He didn't. He ends verse 27 talking about becoming disqualified. That's what he's worried about for these brethren, is them becoming disqualified. And so he's presenting to us an example that they understood, but he said that they obviously were ignorant of the proper application of this example, and he did not want them to be ignorant. Let me get to my questions here, so I know Harry spent some time working on these, so Number one is the account of Israel being led by the cloud through the sea, divided on both sides, stated as fiction, allegory, or historical event. Historical event, that's right. It's not an allegory. He's using this example to teach a lesson, but it's not an allegory. This happened. And he said this happened, and it was recorded for a reason. We'll be getting to that in just a moment. So he's giving us this example of what happened to them. He says, I don't want you to be ignorant or unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, passed through the sea. I want you to notice something in this text. He said, notice how many times he says all. All our fathers were under the cloud. All passed through the sea. All baptized. All ate the same spiritual food. All drank the same spiritual drink. Verse 5. But with what? Most of them, God was not well pleased. Not well pleased corresponds to that word disqualified back here in chapter 9 and verse 27. Disqualified in the Greek, what it means is that a person has been not well pleasing. So that's what he's talking about. We need to be conscientious of not being disqualified. And he said, I know that you know all about what's right and what's wrong. You know what? You can still be disqualified. You can still be not well pleasing to God. Because your pride in what you know can put blinders on you to where you actually slip into an area that is sinful. And that's what they were doing. And that's why this example is brought up. He's giving us an example of Israel, and one that we're very, very familiar with. And why would this be a pertinent example of, in this realm of liberties, and what he's talking about being disqualified? Kurt?
Well, it's another proof text for the idea that God's chosen people can still be lost, can still get into an area where, because of their lust for evil, they do not please God and wind up dying in the wilderness, so to speak.
People who ate of that spiritual food and drank of that spiritual drink, and yet they still allowed themselves to lust after evil things, to commit sexual immorality and all these things. And he said, look at this. What else? What else do you see here that stands out to you? Any other reasons why he would use this example and not, I mean, there were a lot of Old Testament examples. So definitely, yes, sir.
Yeah, they served idols.
Yeah, that's right.
Just like referring back to the previous verses where they were talking about idols.
He's going to take us to Exodus 32. While he's not going to necessarily quote that or reference it, he's going to take us back to that event. And he's wanting them to understand that here are people that had been saved. Initial obedience does not guarantee perseverance. We talk about once saved, always saved. Calvin called it the perseverance of the saints. That is not guaranteed. That is the whole point of what he's saying here, because in chapters 8 and 9, they thought they had it in the bank. They thought that they knew what was going on. They couldn't be wrong. They couldn't be lost. And he said, you better be careful. You better give a second look at that. Angie?
Well, and when we look back at Israel in that time, what laid them low was when they were looking back to what they were trusting in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And they let their trust in God falter, and they put their trust in what would be worldly things. And when we put our trust in the tradition or the liberty that we have established for ourselves, that that's the right thing, and it becomes separate from God, it becomes an evil thing. And we have Israel doing that in just all throughout the Old Testament, and that's what they're condemned for throughout the being sent away into captivity, and before they have to come back, what they have to repent of. They always did something that God said was spiritual. They went through the motions.
Mm-hmm.
But their faith was not in what God told them to do, what they thought was going to protect them in the moment. They didn't see God as being that protection. And getting confused about the idols is doing the same thing.
Absolutely. Very, very good. It's worldliness. It's here. You know, we have, make sure I'm not getting ahead of myself with the questions. Question number 2, and I really have already walked all over this one, but why did the vast majority of those delivered from Egyptian bondage die in the wilderness? Disobedience, unbelief. They were not well-pleasing, corresponding back to that word disqualified. And he's giving us an example of what happened to them. And he's essentially, I would suggest to you that he's saying idolatry is very easy to slip into. That's what we're going to see a little bit later in this chapter. He's going to say, therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. This is an easy thing to slip into, and you can even have an awful lot of knowledge, and these people did. And they had all of these blessings, and yet they allowed themselves to become disqualified. You know, there's another question here. Maybe that was the... Oh, okay, we're going to get to that just a little bit later. So when he's talking about them being baptized into Moses, what does that mean? I know what it means to be baptized into Christ. Why does he call this being baptized into Moses? How was it a baptism?
The way I always looked at it is the life of the nation of Israel is much like the life of Christians today. The crossing of the Red Sea is their initial baptism. The wilderness wanderings is their life either growing in faith or going away from God. And then Paul refers to the crossing of the Jordan
And I think that's accurate. How could this correspond to baptism, New Testament baptism, though? What would the likeness be? Is water, that's right. It was a water baptism. But they didn't get wet. So in what would the other likeness be here?
Separated them from their bondage.
That's right. That was a passage. They went from bondage to freedom. And he said, and this was a point that maybe it is on the... I didn't make the question, so it's hard for me to keep up with where I'm supposed to be on those. But I'm just going to go with it. We'll answer those things as we talk. So he talks about the fact, when we look at that there was they were under the cloud and all passed through the sea. It's interesting. What is a cloud made up of? They were entombed in water. And that's significant to me. I'm scared of big water. I don't mind being out on the lake and, little pond, but when I get out there in the big, deep water, that's scary to me. And I think that we need to take a minute every now and then to think about what that was like when Moses said, let's go. And he went down into the belly of that sea. I know it was dry land, but we've never walked into the belly of the sea with walls of water on each side, and you don't see the sky. There's water on top of you. And they had to have tremendous faith. Yes, faith in God, but who was leading them? Who was their visible Savior? Moses. He was the one God sent to lead them out of the bondage to freedom. So in that sense, he was a type of Christ. Therefore, they were baptized into Moses. Their faith was that Moses was a man sent from God that was going to lead them into that. They were entombed in water. It was a burial. It was water. It corresponds. And what he's telling us here, and so if his point is, be careful lest you be disqualified. A person who has never been saved doesn't have to worry about being disqualified. They're not well-pleasing to God already. His whole point is to tell us, here are people who have been saved. But what happened to them? Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. So if that baptism into Moses did not represent their salvation, and it did, as you said, you've got to completely miss the whole point of that to not see that they passed through the sea. Their captors, which would be like Satan keeping us in bondage to our sin, or our sins rather, that keep us in bondage. Their captors followed them, and what happened to them? And they woke up in the morning and saw them washed up on the seashore, dead. Their captors were washed away. This corresponds to baptism. And the whole point of it is they were saved, but then later they were lost. Two really important points here. Baptism represents when we're saved, and it also shows that we can still be lost. Those are obviously tremendous issues for a lot of people. So, any comments or thoughts about that?
So I think it's interesting how 8, 9, and 10, it's dealing with meat specifically, but in the early parts of them, when they passed through the Red Sea, their initial desires was for meat. They wanted the meat of Egypt. They wanted the food. Their food became their idols.
Flesh pots, yeah.
And so God sent them the quail, and thousands of them died because they wanted the meat. And here he's making that correlation here. Look, don't let this meat kill your brother.
Yeah. And it is. There's so many of those connections that are there. Number 3 in the questions, because we're going to get to this point. What specific sins did the text attribute to the generation of the Israelites who died in the wilderness? What did he give us? Yeah. Yeah. Lusted after evil things, and then he specifies what several of these things were. So here they are. they allowed themselves to fall into this realm of idolatry. I think it's interesting, he says in verse 7, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. He's quoting here, and he's telling us this was the manifestation of idolatry. This is what idolatry is all about. When they sat down to eat and drink, they were eating to that idol. That's what they had learned in Egypt. And what's Paul dealing with? The main problem is these Christians are going into the idol's temple and eating that meat there. So he's talking about these people slipped into this idolatry, and he says, and it wasn't just the wandering in the wilderness where they all died. He said, there were situations where the sexual immorality, what's that referring us back to? What event? Bronze serpent? Yeah, I think that's one where they complained and he sent the fiery serpents. I think the sexual immorality is Numbers 25 with Balaam and Balak. And what did Balaam tell Balak to do in order to destroy Israel? He couldn't curse them. What did he tell the king to do? Entice them with idolatry. And what was associated with idolatry? Prostitution and sexual sin. And we have the account of the man who brought this essentially a temple harlot into the camp, and Phinehas went in and killed both of them. So all of these are examples of what happens in regard to idolatry. They tempted Christ in verse 9. What's that saying? This is an Old Testament event. What does that tell you? He was there. That's right. Pre-existence of Christ. He's God. And so then he goes on and he says, all these things happened to them for what? Examples. And that was one of the questions, and I can't find it, that Harry asked about what does it tell us about examples. Number 5. What does this teach us about the use of examples in the Bible? Pardon me? For our learning. That's right. We're supposed to learn from these examples. And they stand as authoritative. They teach us something in this regard. So he says that these things are written, and they were, verse 11? They happened to them as examples and were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. So, that gets us to a text that we're very, very familiar with, in verse 12 and verse 13. Therefore, let him who stands take heed lest he fall. That goes back to chapter 8 and 9. He's saying, I know that you think you have knowledge. That's how he started out chapter 8. You better take heed, because you might be slipping into idolatry and you don't think that you are. That happens to a lot of us because we rationalize what we're doing. So he says, verse 13, but you don't have to go there. You can overcome this. You can win this battle. You're not going to be tempted beyond what you are able. So then in verse 14 he says, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. So, therefore, refers back to that whole story. That, as Kurt was saying, that's about idolatry here. People who were saved that fell into idolatry. He said, flee from idolatry. I think, what's the next question here? I just read it. Number 7 says, how would one flee idolatry? How would they obey that command? Okay, run away. That's right. But are there any Old Testament examples or just Bible examples that help us to understand the concept of fleeing? Joe, yeah, that's the one that comes to us. Were you going to say that, Jason? Okay. Joseph, yes, fled from Potiphar's wife. I know what that means. I know what it means to flee. We had a sermon the other day where I was talking about this idea of fleeing, and I was talking about it, an example where Taylor and I were in Alaska hiking, and we heard a bear roar really close to us. And I know what it means to flee. Flee from idolatry. So he's telling them, you don't need to get as close to idolatry as you can. We try to explain this to our kids. We need to learn this ourselves. The next part of the question was, how do we flee certain sins? Absolutely. Tom?
Well, I think it's interesting, that this verse 14 is right after 13, where, he assures us that there's nothing that we are going to face in our life that God has not given us the ability to overcome or to escape. And then he says right after that, therefore flee, from idolatry. I think sometimes there's a disconnect for us when it comes to idolatry, because in our mind, that is an Old Testament problem. In the sense of when we think of idols, when we think of these graven images or things like that, of course we always make the connection. Idolatry is anything that you put before God. But and that is obviously true. But in this sense of these idols and how they were treated in this time, they were a huge part of a lot of people's lives that made a lot of impact. And the idea of fleeing from something that was so vital, he's trying to assure them that no matter how difficult you think this is, getting rid of something that you held once as a god, or that someone you know held as a god, he's saying you can get through it. God is going to give you a way. And whatever that is, whether it be burning it down, destroying it, melting it, whatever, fleeing from it in the sense of going around that temple, going around those places that are causing you to fall back into that, that realm of idolatry. He's saying, or he just said, God's giving you a way of escape. There's nothing you are going to face in this life. But I do think that, we read about this idolatry, and sometimes there's a disconnect with us as Christians because of the sins that we face. Idolatry to me is at the top of my temptation list. I don't have a lot of problems worshiping an image, but there are a lot of other temptations that I have. So if I make the connection of, he's saying this is a very important fact that there's nothing we can't flee from. Flee from this. What's my temptation? What is my weakness? What is my past sin or something that I have a problem with? God says there's a way of escape.
So there are some things that we're challenged with that God says, take a stand, Brett. You need to stand up to this. There are other things he says, run, flee. We don't need to get those mixed up. What are some other things that God tells us to flee from? Sexual immorality. We don't need to be anywhere close to anything that's going to take us down that path. We need to run the other direction. There are some sins that are so catastrophic, so tempting, so dangerous, so addictive that he says, you don't gut this one out. You need to run. Drop everything, like I did with the bear, and run. Foster?
I always think Romans 13:14 says that put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts. A lot of times we put ourselves in a bad place. You can put a lot of things in that. If you put yourself in a bad place, you messed up already.
Yeah.
You've already done something that God said you should do. You're making provision to fill lusts.
Yeah. And I think that the temptation is to make provision for the flesh, and then when it gets really bad and we're in trouble, we want to pray the prayer of Jesus, deliver me from temptation, like we're calling out to Captain Kirk to, take us up to the ship now, get me out of this. That's not how it works. He said, I'm going to give you a way of escape, and this is the way. Flee, run. I'm going to give you the direction and the information you need. That's how God delivers us from temptation. We look to His Word. He instructs us, and when we follow it, He takes us away from temptation. Scott?
You're fleeing physically and mentally.
Yes, yes. Absolutely.
If it's a certain place that causes you to sin, you flee from that area or that place, but you also have to get it out of your mind once you're away from it. Usually one's in front of the other, but not always. It can be the location you're at that makes you do it.
Yeah.
Or you thinking about it so much takes you to that location.
Something you're listening to gets it in your mind, or something you see.
And when we flee, we know where we go.
Yeah.
And I think circle of this is like we're told to avoid that temptation, we're told to flee from it, and we're given that home in the Word to know Christ and to where we should focus our mind. The house that we sweep out, if we don't put anything back into it, the devil comes back in. So once we flee, we have to flee towards something, and that should be towards Christ.
That's great. DJ and then Jason.
And when it comes back to idols, like Tyler was saying, I put a lot of thought into what technically an idol, or what the temptation to worship an idol would be. And I think today we have to deal with the cross. A lot of people hold the cross as an idol. They wear the cross, and that protects them. As long as I have that. And when you put your faith into those idols, it seems easier because you don't have to make a decision. You're protected by something outside of your realm. And that's why I think it's so scary to fall into those idol temptations, because your faith goes into an object that will not protect you.
Yeah, and that would be a tempting thing, especially in a culture like that. Yes.
James 14, it talks about that snowball effect of temptation leading to sin.
Yeah.
There's a point where you start that process into motion. There's that crucial time where it's born. It begins like a flame. And, being able to put that out in the beginning when it's small, it's a small flame, is much easier than when it progresses to a point where it's such a mammoth effort to stop it, or even being able to stop it. And like Foster said, you've got yourself into a position, even if it was a liberty at that point.
And that's what I want us to make sure we come back to, is understand that these people thought they knew what was sinful and what wasn't, and they're in the realm of not sinful, so they're okay. But they didn't realize they were slipping. Gerald?
Your dad, Tom, used to call the television the one-eyed monster and stuff, put the poor kids before us. And it's kind of like, watching stuff, and it's like a frog getting boiled in water. You're sitting there, you get used to that. First thing you know, you're in trouble. We have what we put into the line, like garbage in, garbage out. So that's something that's real dangerous and prevalent in the society that we live in.
It is. Very good comments. I want to move on because I haven't even gotten halfway through this, and I've already had one light switch. So now he says, flee from idolatry. I speak to you as to wise men. I want you, look at that. Judge for yourselves what I say. Here's another passage where the Bible's telling us God calls on you to discern what this means. And he brings up the Lord's Supper, the cup of blessing, which we bless. Is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break is not the communion of the body of Christ. So he uses the Lord's Supper as an example of partaking of something and being in fellowship with that, right? He even brings up the Old Testament altar and how those people that ate the meat of the animal that was sacrificed, why did they eat that meat? To be a part of the sacrifice. That put them in fellowship with that sacrifice. So then he's saying in verse 10, or in verse 19, he said, so what am I saying? Am I saying that an idol is anything? No. It's not. You're saying, oh, I know what I'm doing. An idol is nothing. He said, that's not the point. The point is, while you know that idol means nothing, you have let yourself get so close to idolatry, now you're eating in the idol's temple, and you don't even have the self-awareness to know that you're in fellowship with that idol. There are things that we can do that put us in fellowship with things that are sinful. And we might be able to rationalize it and say, well, that's nothing. Well, I don't mean that. He said, you've got to be careful about what you allow yourself to become in fellowship with. That's the whole point of that. And the danger of not being able to see how quickly we can get there. This is the reason we have to be circumspect, Ephesians chapter 5. Do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. We've got to realize the tactics that Satan uses. He's not going to hold up a sign and say, hey, get ready, I'm coming at you. It's going to be subtle. It's going to be slow. It's going to be over a period of time. And that's how he was working with these people. He said that you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. The idol was nothing. But you know who's behind idolatry? The demons. I know that idol is nothing, but Satan is not nothing. And that's what you're doing. You're putting yourself in fellowship with his work when you go into this idol's temple. So as he concludes this, starting in verse 23, he said, all things are lawful. He's talking about things that are liberties. All these things are lawful for me, but not all are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things edify. Well, then how do I handle that? He says, quit seeking your own. Quit putting yourself first. Doesn't that sound like Philippians chapter 2? He said, you need to have the mind of Christ. Think of others better than yourself. And when you do that, you're not going to fall into this trap. But when you get so determined that this is a liberty and nobody's going to tell me I can't do this, you're going to allow yourself to be so stubborn about it that you actually end up doing something that is sinful. Even though the meat is nothing and the idol is nothing, eating that meat in the idol's temple conveys fellowship with that idolatry. So, in wrapping up then, he tells them that you've got some different scenarios that come up here. You go into the marketplace, and a great deal of the meat that was sold in the marketplace was meat from an animal that had been sacrificed to an idol. How do you handle that? Don't ask. There's nothing wrong with that food. God gave us all that food. Don't ask. But what if you go to buy that meat and the person says, with this you'll be in fellowship with this idol. This was offered to this idol. Don't do that. Don't partake in that. Yeah, don't eat that. What if you go to someone's house and they have meat? Don't ask. Just eat it. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with that food. But if the person states to you that this is meat from an animal that's been sacrificed to an idol, and it's a matter of conscience to them, he says, don't eat that. It's not worth it. Don't go there. But you know what's interesting? So what he's telling them is, and again, he's talking about doing something that's going to lead somebody else to do something that's wrong. He's not talking about hurting someone's feelings or doing something that someone else doesn't want to do. There's a lot of people that have real strict opinions about a lot of things, and they say, well, if you do that, you're going to offend my conscience. I don't think I'm going to make you do this if I do it. You're pretty resolute in what you're doing. That's not this context. But he goes on down here and he says that in verse 29, conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other, for why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? That's why he's saying, when no one's making this a point of conscience, don't go in there and ask, what is this? You don't have to be a slave to everyone's opinion, to everyone's conscience. But if this is a matter of conscience, and you doing it is going to embolden them to do something that will cause them to sin against their conscience, and you don't care because you're going to eat meat, then that's a sin for you. What it boils down to is doing all things for the glory of God. That needs to be our overall motive in everything that we do. Is this going to glorify God? And when I'm being selfish and I'm going to have my rights, and I don't care how this impacts you, that does not glorify God. And that's how I'm going to end up being disqualified.
Chapter 11 is going to be up there.
Thank you. Very good. Thank you for your good comments and your attention.